Hello everybody, it's me Julian and welcome to the Monday morning Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. I am joining you live from London, where this past week I actually had the pleasure of attending a Slavoj Žižek and Roger Penrose discussion, which was being held at the Institute of Art and Ideas. It's their London festival. However, unfortunately, Žižek wasn't able to attend in person, which was quite disappointing. He was joining us via a live feed, and they talked about quantum mechanics, the ontological incompleteness of reality, etc. It was quite fun. So, and I should say the best thing is that I got to meet some members of our learning community at the event, which was very fun. So shout out to everybody I was able to meet at the event. Today, I would like to talk about why only psychoanalysis can save philosophy. At least that's Slavoj Žižek's argument. I'm going to try to break down that argument by means of introducing you to the relationship between imaginary identification and symbolic identification, which is a key Lacanian reworking of some Freudian concepts, what Freud refers to as the ideal ego and the ego ideal, otherwise known as the small I and the big I. And so if you'd like to stick around for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be breaking down those conceptual arguments, using some examples along the way. And thank you, as always, to the members of our learning community from across the globe, and a special thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep hosting these classes every single week. If you'd like to support my work, you can do so by either following this channel or by purchasing one of my ebooks on my Patreon. The latest is called The Silence of the Drives, which is an introduction to the death drive. But you can also download the complete guide to Žižek volumes 1 through 8 on my Patreon. Once again, thank you to everybody joining us today. Okay, so let's dive right in. Slavoj Žižek argues that only psychoanalysis can save philosophy from itself. And that's a pretty bold claim to make, so I thought it might be worth noting what exactly he has in mind. But perhaps in order to answer that question, we have to think about what it is exactly that psychoanalysis, and Lacanian psychoanalysis in particular, does. And the way in which Žižek likes to describe the, if you will, goal, or in Lacanese, the aim, I'll explain that in a moment, of psychoanalytic treatment is that the subject's hysteria has to undergo a transition from being in itself to for itself, which is a sort of tacit reference to the Hegelian transition from being in itself to being for itself. In other words, Žižek basically argues that Lacanian psychoanalysis presupposes that the subject is hysterical, which is to say the subject is trapped in the desire of the other, and thereby in his desire to be for the other. The classic hysterical question is, what am I to you? And the goal of psychoanalysis is therefore to essentially not eliminate hysteria in the subject, but instead to transpose the object of the subject's hysteria back onto the subject himself. In other words, the question is no longer who am I for them, for the other, but the question becomes who am I for myself? Essentially becomes an inquiry into one's own identity. And this is the sort of constitutive argument of all psychoanalysis, that the subject is split. Lacan essentially proposes an identity of disidentification, or if you will, a subjectivity of pure difference, what you might call universal difference. This is, of course, part of Lacan's structuralism, the idea that there is a central antagonism, not just to social reality, but also one that is embedded within the subject as such. Now, this is all quite jargon-laden, so it doesn't necessarily help us answer the question, why can psychoanalysis save philosophy from itself? However, I've already introduced the key elements, which is to say, the Lacanian position is that the subject must undergo a transition from hysteria in itself, namely what am I to the other, towards hysteria for itself, what am I for myself. And the introduction of an identity of disidentification, a subject that is radically constitutively split from within, is a formal structure that Žižek then applies to what you might call classic metaphysics. The traditional metaphysical model, essentially, as I've said before, posits a binary between essence and appearance. Then, hence, the project of philosophy, the pursuit of philosophy, is the identification of the ideal, pure form, truth. However, Zizek proposes a different hermeneutic operation, namely an interpretive mechanism by which the very gap between the subject, the world of phenomena, and essence is itself transposed back onto essence as such. In other words, it's not about the immanent gap between the subjective phenomena that constitute its reality and the essence that is supposed to be the overarching governing structure that gives meaning to this reality. Instead, it is precisely the ontological incompleteness of reality as such that is constitutive, not detractive of and to the idea of essence, the idea of essence as such. However, once again, we are knee-deep in jargon, so I'm going to try to explain a little bit further, but that's the basic argument. Philosophy in its traditional metaphysical mode, the pre-Kantian, if you will, Platonic idealism, which Zizek refers to as naive idealism, essentially is upended through Kant and Hegel, and it is only through the Leanian psychoanalytic approach that we can understand a hermeneutics, or if you will, even an ontology of incompleteness, identity of disidentification. Now, what I'd like to do here to essentially elaborate a little bit further is to talk about the difference between imaginary identification and symbolic identification. So to put it very simply, imaginary identification is the ideal image that you have of yourself, like how you would like to appear to others, and the image that you have of yourself that if you were to meet it, you would also yourself feel like you were worthy of love. Hence, the imaginary identification is what Freud referred to as the ideal ego. It's the image that you have of your head that structures who you would like to be. However, this is juxtaposed by symbolic identification. And symbolic identification is the disembodied gaze, which is supposed to confirm your imaginary identification. It's the disembodied space or stage or theater which ratifies your imaginary image of yourself. Let's say, for example, that you consider yourself to be a good person. It might be that by means of engaging in charity or kindness towards others, you confirm to yourself that you are a good person. It might be that you like to think of yourself as extraordinarily lucky and wealthy, and by means of posting pictures of yourself doing fun things and spending money on luxury products, you confirm to yourself that you are indeed lucky and fortunate and wealthy. In other words, the basic mechanism is that symbolic identification is the framework that guarantees the possibility of imaginary identification, which is to say, strictly speaking, imaginary identification is always a priori structured by the symbolic. But Zizek actually introduces a really interesting distinction here, and if you're curious about this, you can find it in an early passage in his Sublime Object of Ideology, in which he says that, strictly speaking, imaginary identification is that which we think we can imitate in others, the features of others' existence that we would like to see reflected back in us. Whereas symbolic identification is that inimitable kernel, that part that can't be imitated in others, which therefore guarantees imaginary identification. Let's say, for example, that you make a religious argument about this. Let's say that you are a Christian who believes or worships Christ. On the level of imaginary identification, you might say, well, I want to be like Christ. I want to act like him. I want to essentially see him as a model for life. Whereas on the level of symbolic identification, you nevertheless uphold Christ as the figure of absolute authority, as God. In other words, on the level of imaginary identification, you imitate Christ in his actions. However, on the level of the symbolic, he must necessarily remain inimitable, someone you can't actually replace. This means that you act as he did, but nevertheless you have to uphold him as an inimitable figure, namely God, the person who upholds the very specter, the symbolic framework through which your imaginary identification functions. But you can even see another example of this when it comes to like people's names. Let's say you look at the difference between your first name and your last name. You could say that the first name is imaginary identification. This is who you are. It's the the label, if you will, that is being given to you at birth, and it is up to you to fill it in with whatever psychic content you have in mind for yourself. However, your last name is the affiliation that you have to your family, and thereby to a vast network of symbolic identifications. It's essentially pre-programmed for you. And so on the level of the imaginary, for example, I am Julian, I could be anybody and do anything, I will make a name for myself in the world. This imaginary identification is nevertheless bolstered and upheld by symbolic identification, which is the network of my social relations to my family, my friends, my profession, everything that is implied by my name. Of course, in contemporary life, your last name is not nearly as meaningful as it used to be. It doesn't necessarily connote your standing in life, whether you're an aristocrat, etc. And yet here we can see the same sort of attachment. The imaginary identification, the level of the first name, is that which is free for you to fill in. The symbolic identification is that which is inimitable, that which stands external to you, which somehow supports the very background against which you can have your imaginary identification as such. Now, let's return for a moment to the Freudian aspect here. After all, what Lacan essentially does is that he radicalizes the Freudian position. When Freud introduces the idea that we have a subject of the unconscious, namely a subject that is predetermined and overdetermined, if you will, by sexuality, what he really means isn't eros as such. Freud isn't, strictly speaking, writing about sexual desire in a purely, if you will, instrumental way. It's not simply the sexual manifest content of desire. Instead, when Freud writes about sexuality, he's fundamentally writing about identity and difference, which is to say that sexuality is the a priori primordial differentiation that structures the subject, both on the level of sex and gender, but also specifically psychically in relationship to the other, the longing and desire that we feel for the other, and for Freud, of course, in an Oedipal sense, for the mother, and the father is the figure of authority. In other words, Freud essentially already introduces a distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic on the Oedipal level. The imaginary identification is with the mother, which is to say the Oedipal desire isn't simply to lie or lay with the mother in a direct sexual sense. It is also that the mother is the space upon which the subject projects the very imaginary content of his or her own existence, that undefinable X, that kernel that he believes makes him lovable. Whereas symbolic identification occurs on the level of the name of the father, the one who prohibits the union of the child with the mother and therefore casts the child out into the symbolic network of the social world proper. And what Lacan essentially does is that he radicalizes Freud by means of taking the central insight of sexuality, namely that identity is essentially predicated by difference, which has the name sexuality, and applies this to the social sphere as such. Which is to say, Lacan essentially posits that psychoanalysis is inherently political, which is to say, psychoanalysis is a hermeneutic framework, i.e. an interpretive mechanism by which we can understand the way in which social relations are structured, and, if you will, the power structures that underlie them. This, of course, places Lacan distinctly within the 1960s French intellectual tradition, which isn't to say that Lacan is one of the enragés or existentialist thinkers. Nothing could be less true. Lacan is in many ways a deeply conservative figure. Lacan, after all, always said that even the protester is simply a hysteric who wants to be told by his master to remain impotent, or, as Lacan puts it, so is simply someone in search of another master. Lacan is therefore not necessarily a progressive thinker in this precise sense, and yet the consequences of his thought are much more progressive if you think about them. Sartrean existentialism remains conservative at heart, as it essentially advocates a kind of biopolitics by which the subject can create himself in a manner that would prove perfectly adaptable and plug-inable, if you will, complementary to the emergence of capitalism and lifestyle lifestyle ideology. Lacanian psychoanalysis, on the other hand, insists on a kind of radical difference that is embedded within the subject as such. There is no possibility, from a Lacanian perspective, for the subject to truly create himself, to truly be independent. The problem of difference can't be overcome, it can simply be acknowledged, which is to say, once again, that on the level of hysteria, namely, what am I to the other, the problem from a Lacanian perspective cannot be resolved. It can simply be displaced. It can be displaced back onto the subject as such. In other words, the Lacanian ontological position is that the point of psychoanalysis is not to overcome hysteria, namely, not to kind of confer upon the subject a kind of non-differential centrality of its being, but instead to displace the difference, the tension between the subject and the other, back onto the subject as such. Namely, not what am I to you, but what am I to myself. And the Žižekian insight, which is really quite simple if you put it in those terms, is to take the implicit Lacanian ontology, which is an ontology of radical difference and antagonism, or the process by which hysteria is constitutive to the subject rather than detractive of it, and he takes this ontological position and he applies it to the Hegelian ontology. After all, strictly speaking, if the classical hermeneutic framework is to overcome the barrier or the gap between the subjective position, the world of phenomenal reality, and the world of essence, the world of transcendental reality, this gap, of course, can't be overcome. And so the Hegelian position is that what appears in itself must in fact undergo a transition for being for itself, which is to say the gap between phenomenal reality and essential or transcendental reality cannot by definition be overcome. To this extent, Kant was already correct. However, what can be done is a formal shift can take place, which Lacan refers to as anamorphosis, which Žižek refers to as the parallax gap, by which this very gap between subjective reality and transcendental reality is transferred back into and upon subjective reality as such. In other words, the formal impossibility of any reconciliation between the subjective stance and the transcendental stance is itself constitutive of the ideal, if you will, stance as such, what Hegel calls idealism of the spirit. And to make this a little bit simpler for a moment, here Žižek actually makes reference to his mentor in all things Lacanian, namely Jacques-Alain Miller. And Jacques-Alain Miller comes up with this quite clever distinction between identification, which is constituted, and identification, which is constitutive. And Miller's argument works like this. He essentially says that imaginary identification, the ideal ego, is essentially constituted, whereas symbolic identification, or the ego ideal, is constitutive. Now, what he essentially means by this is that imaginary identification appears as a priori. It appears as true to the subject. I am who I am, and I simply look towards my external surroundings to confirm upon myself that I am already who I am. It's essentially a subjectivity of pure identification. X equals X. Whereas what this does is that it disavows the fundamental a priori structure by which symbolic identification always has to a priori create the very foundations for such an imaginary identification to take place, but perhaps more importantly, to then retroactively confer upon it a supposed ontological completeness. What I'm trying to say here is that symbolic identification, which Miller refers to as constitutive, is therefore both a priori constitutive to the subject, but also retroactively creates the very integrity of the subject in its very failure to stand on any solid grounding. Which is to say, Alain Miller essentially draws upon Lacan to make the argument that the relationship between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, namely the relationship between imaginary identification and symbolic identification, is essentially dialectical. In fact, as I've already said before, perhaps instead of saying that it is dialectical, we could also say that it is chiasmic in nature. If you look at the expression ideal ego and ego ideal, we already see the chiasmic dialectic that is implied. The chiasmic formula or structure being A, B, X, B, A. Or to put it in rhetorical terms, the famous ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Here we have the same rhetorical structure of A, B, X, B, A. It essentially mirrors itself. The same can be said when it comes to the relationship between imaginary identification and symbolic identification, namely the ideal ego and the ego ideal. It's not that the ideal ego is a priori to the constitutive function of the ego ideal, it is that they are dialectically or chiasmically intertwined. It's at the very point of failure of the ideal ego to be in itself that the symbolic identity, the ego ideal, becomes for itself to the therefore retroactive subjective content of the imaginary identification. Now, Zizek takes this Lacanian chiasm between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, if you will, this constitutive function of the subject's incompleteness, and imposes it back onto the ontological framework, which is that of Hegel. Hegel's ontology is to do the same thing apropos essence and appearance. Namely, when Hegel argues that essence emerges as appearance qua appearance, he's essentially making the same argument. Essence is not a binary distinction from appearance. Essence, in its very incomplete form, namely appearance, emerges as essence proper, and vice versa. Appearance is therefore a constitutive entity by which essence can be thought and made manifest. In other words, essence, and this is the key ontological insight of Hegelian metaphysics, essence comes into being for itself precisely by that which appears to be its imminent point of impossibility, namely appearance itself. Hence, the transition from appearance in itself to appearance for itself is not actually the turning around of anything. It's not an upside down movement. Instead, it is a purely formal shift in perspective, one which Lacan would liken to anamorphosis, and which Zizek once again likens to a parallax gap, by which the very barrier between essence and appearance comes to be seen in a different light as that which creates the necessity of both. In other words, to put it in Zizek's terms, Zizek's ontology is essentially that the gap between reality and transcendental reality is immanent to reality as such. Hence, what Zizek calls the ontological incompleteness of reality. And this ontological incompleteness, rather than being that which bars us from essence, is itself the only formal structure or mechanism by which essence emerges in the first place, as emptied out from itself. Of course, for those of you who are interested in theology, you can actually see the Christian elements in Hegel's thought here. What takes place is essentially a form of kenosis, an emptying out of essence into its perceived point of impossibility, so as to be essentially materialized in its ideal form. We can see the same thing in the New Testament and the crucifixion. Christ, as the representative of God, must appear to us as horribly inept. And yet it is precisely in the failure of Christ to be the divine emissary of power who changes the world and saves himself, it is precisely in this movement that the gap between God and man is transposed back into man as such. Hence, the moment of the Trinity isn't simply a unity of three, but if you will, a chiasmic moment, a moment of four. Namely, the Trinity isn't simply that of the Holy Spirit, by which the Holy Spirit is counted as the third element, but the Holy Spirit is precisely the X that binds together in dialectical and chiasmic fashion the transition from God above into God below, and man below into man above. Hence, the process of kenosis, the emptying out, which is thereby also a filling in, is precisely this dialectical movement, which therefore cannot strictly speaking be counted as two, but must be counted as three. However, one of the passages that Zizek likes to point out in Hegel's logic is the one in which Hegel argues that this dialectical movement, strictly speaking, shouldn't just be counted as three, but should be counted as four. And I like to see this as evidence of what you might call my chiasmic theory. When I refer to chiasm, I'm not referring to a Gramscian semiotic square. Instead, what I'm referring to is precisely this formal structure by which the dialectic is not simply the temporal sequence between 1, 2, and 3, or A, B, and C. It is not simply thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but instead it is the very process by which every thesis is a priori the manifestation of its own synthesis, both its resolution as well as its incompleteness. Therefore, to be quite precise here, the moment of chiasm is the process by which the dialectic is counted as 4, namely not 1, 2, 3, but instead A, B, X, which therefore implicitly applies A, B, X, B, A. Now, of course, if you count those out in a formal sequence, namely A, B, X, B, A, it appears that you have 5 and not 4 things. And yet the X is the point, the dialectical vanishing mediator, if you will, by which we see in retrospect that every A was already the mediation of an A-B moment in its inverse. To bring this back to Leanian psychoanalysis, if we take the ideal ego and realize that the ideal ego is itself structured both a priori and retroactively by the ego ideal, we can see the exact same movement. No ideal ego without ego ideal, and vice versa. However, it is not enough to simply imply that they are dialectically attached at the hip. Instead, there must be some gap. There must be some empty space, which is retroactively filled in, the space of X. And this space, according to Leanian psychoanalysis, is the barred subject, the subject that is constitutively split between imaginary and symbolic identification. Once again, Zizek's ontology is therefore to take this barred subject of Leanian psychoanalysis, which, as I said before, is predicated upon the sexual differentiation introduced in the Freudian notion of the unconscious, and to place this back upon the Hegelian ontology. The Hegelian ontology being that of the dialectic, or the process by which essence appears only in what appears to be its immanent barrier or failure, namely appearance as such. Once again, therefore, the dialectic isn't simply a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's not a temporal sequence of 1, 2, 3 in any linear sense. Instead, I would argue, it is the very content that lies hidden within the form as to the immanent impossibility of essence's appearance without the fall into the subjective barrier. Once again, that is to say, the chiasmic model is therefore not a formal feature which can be placed upon the Hegelian hermeneutic framework. Instead, it is, if you will, an attempt to map out what you might call the hidden content within Hegel's latent formalism. Now, what is Hegel's latent formalism? Well, if you think about it, Hegel is an anti-formalist in the extreme. He's arguing against the Fichtean Kantian formalism of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the extreme transcendental formalism of essence and appearance. However, in my own reading of Hegel, and I think we can draw this out from Zizek's Lacanian structuralist interpretation of Hegel, we can say that Hegel therefore proposes what is essentially a formalism of anti-formalism. The dialectic is patently not a mystical system of pure or absolute spirit, but instead the very process by which the formal features or the structure of the impossibility of any substantive resolution between essence and appearance can be mapped out and known. Of course, Hegel's quote-unquote mysticist inversion is to argue that it is not the subject who can know essence, but that it is essence which effectively knows itself in and through subjective knowing of essence. Here we can see how Hegel essentially breaks traditional metaphysics by detaching the philosophical project from the how Hegel detaches the metaphysical project from that of being the subject who knows essence by means of essentially positing that it is essence which knows itself through the subjective stance. It is easy to understand why people would infer upon that model a kind of mystical leaning. And yet, to understand Hegel's Christian implications is to understand how this could not be true. In the same way that in the crucifixion, it is not simply that man is brought up and reunited with God, but precisely the other way around, that it is God who is brought back down to man and therefore essentially makes man in his image reconciled with him and vice versa. In the same way, Hegel, quote unquote, breaks the traditional, if you will, Old Testament Platonic metaphysics, namely the gap between the fallen, lowly, sunken, phenomenal world of appearance and the ideal world of essence and truth, and inverts the structure by which, so that the very immutable impossibility, the Kantian thing in itself, becomes that which saves philosophy from itself. Hence, Zizek's argument is that Lacanian psychoanalysis and the implicit dialectical structure, which I refer to as chiasmic, of the relationship between imaginary identification and symbolic identification, namely the ideal ego and the ego ideal, can be read as a formula of sorts by which to bring about and highlight a different reading of Hegel, and therefore to bring philosophy back on track. Hence, why philosophy, according to Zizek, can only be saved by Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is a roundabout way of saying that Zizek's wager, his central gambit, is that Lacanian psychoanalysis contains the truth of Hegel, and that if we understand Hegel in this way, we can return back to philosophical questions that have significance. Okay, that was very in-depth, but I think that was my attempt to at least give you the central framework of this argument. If you'd like to learn more about this, please do consider taking a look at my Patreon or my other lectures. And if you'd like to support my work, simply follow this channel and join in our discussion. I'm also going to be hosting a seminar right after this on Discord, which I record as a podcast for patrons, and we're going to go live in about 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody. I will see you next week.